Ahoy, you salty sailors. Time to raise anchor and set sail for your best scrawny life. Arr!
This video will be another art lesson for my young nieces. Let's discuss color and layering. Now, there are different kinds of light. Light that comes from the sun, or from a light bulb, or from the light-emitting diodes of a computer screen or a phone screen, is transmitted light, and its primary colors are red, green, and blue. Those colors combine, red and blue combine to make magenta, red and green combine to make yellow, green and blue combine to make cyan, and the three of them together combine to make white light. When white light is reflected off an object, the situation is reversed. The primaries of reflected light are magenta, cyan, and yellow, and they combine to make red, blue, and green. And all three of them together make black, although pigments that we have available to us generally don't make a true black when they're combined, but in theory it would combine to make black. If you're painting on a sheet of paper, you're dealing with reflected light. Now, light, of course, is electromagnetic radiation, and so it's a spectrum of different wavelengths, and each of those wavelengths corresponds to a color when it's interpreted by our brains. These colors have three main properties: hue, saturation, and value. The hue refers to the specific wavelength that corresponds to that particular color. So here we have the primaries, the secondaries, and the tertiaries laid out in a color wheel. And so colors that are across from each other in the color wheel are complementary. So red and cyan would be complementary colors. Colors that are next to each other on the color wheel are analogous. So green and chartreuse would be analogous colors. Saturation, which is also called chroma or intensity, refers to the purity of the color. How much is that reflected light dominated by a single wavelength? A red object, for instance, absorbs all the colors of the spectrum except red. It reflects red back. So it would be a pure red would be a very saturated color, whereas a white or gray object is reflecting all of the colors of the spectrum back, so its saturation is low. Value refers to how light or dark a color is, the density and the amplitude of the radiation being reflected. In this color wheel, the colors are becoming lower in value as they approach the center of the wheel, eventually going to black, which is a value of 0. An important thing to understand is that the primaries, magenta, cyan, and yellow, reach their highest point of saturation at a relatively high value, whereas the secondaries, red, blue, and green, reach their highest point of saturation at a comparatively lower value. So how can I bring this all together into something that a 10-year-old can actually use? Probably the most important thing is to get comfortable with the grays and the browns. Start mixing your colors down. Rather than thinking about your colors as symbols, think of how you can create either contrast or harmony using the three properties of colors in your composition. The reason you may have thought of colors in a symbolic way is because you want to tell a story with your imagery. You want to make it easy for your viewer to interpret the story. So the sky is blue, the grass is green. These are linguistic elements that are easy for your viewer to understand. But areas of contrast tend to become focal points of an image. Let's suppose you're telling a story about a girl who was walking in a meadow and found a beautiful butterfly. Suppose we made the meadow a desaturated green, and we made the butterfly a highly saturated bright red. That would be a point of contrast, so the butterfly would immediately become a focal point in the image, regardless of whether its size was relatively small compared to the rest of the image. So thinking about the three elements of color in terms of harmony and contrast will help you tell your story in a much more detailed and effective way. We'll give an example of this in a moment, but there's a couple other things you should be aware of first. Mainly that the elements of color are relative. They have meaning only in relationship to what surrounds them. Here we see a cube, and on the cube are two small circles, one dark and one light. But of course, they are in fact exactly the same value. You'll notice the highly saturated green, but in the foreground of the grass there's some red that's giving us some contrast, which is what we want. We want contrast in the foreground and less contrast in the background. So let's sample that, and we'll lay down some of that color, and oh, well, it turns out it's not red at all, it's just another green. A green can be a red relative to another green. So, color relativity. So let's tell a story about a farmer with a red barn. Here we've made the grass green. Everyone knows the grass is green. Anyone can see this yellow ball in the sky is the sun. The sky is blue, clouds are white, everyone knows that. Barns are red. It's easy for the viewer to interpret this scene, and yet it's unnatural and doesn't tell the story in an effective way at all. Well, what if we adjusted the proportions a little, and what if we used the lighting and the shadows that we've learned about previously to indicate three-dimensionality of the picture? Would that help? Well, not really. The main thing wrong with this image is its use of color. So here I've pulled the saturation way back in the grass, and there's color movement in that area now. I mean, it's still unnaturally flat, but there's contrast and saturation in the foreground, but in the background it becomes lighter and less saturated. So there's color movement in the grass, and there's also color movement in the sky. We still have a saturated blue on top, but as you come down towards the horizon, it becomes lighter, and there are other colors mixed in that decrease the saturation of that blue. Let's reduce the saturation of the sky and the grass still further until they become analogous colors. And so where the light strikes the side of the barn and there's a little stripe of saturated red, that becomes the focal point, and that gives us a complementary color scheme. But let's take the red out of the barn until all of the colors are analogous. Now we have an analogous color scheme, and it really has a mood, sort of a melancholy, calm mood to it. And I deliberately just used a stick figure and very simple imagery here. There's nothing in this picture that takes years of practice to do. Anyone can do this, and yet the difference between this image and this image is profound. And it's all down to the use of color. This artist has not considered developing harmony and contrast with color in their image, whereas this artist has. So let's set up a blue and orange complementary color scheme. We'll just use these colors and only actually about half of those. Now you'll recall I was telling you girls earlier about a lady who was hunting mule deer in the mountains of Idaho, and I got the drop line, the line that drops down to form the face, a little bit crooked, and I didn't fix it, and it wound up showing up in the final image. So the lesson there is don't be like me and fix those proportions right from the very beginning. But anyway, we'll have a mountain scene here. Now in the actual video, she was using a ball cap, a cap with a bill, to shade her eyes. And she was using a large spotting scope. That's what this cylindrical object in the foreground is. Which is a good idea when you're using optics, and she had a scope on her gun as well. You want your eyes shaded. But I'm going to use some artistic license and get rid of the ball cap, because I want the light to come across the picture and strike the right side of her face and light up, and I want to have some hair, some loose hair there, to catch that light. So we're using a bit of artistic license here. And because I'm attempting to simulate watercolor paint here, we're going to put down a full value sketch. So you can already see that there's going to be contrast in value right where the right side of her face meets the shadow of the mountain. And just like watercolor, we're going to lay down a wash, in this case some very light orange, and then from the other direction a little bit of a gray blue. So the color movement in the sky layer is from light orange to almost a light gray. And we'll have the same sort of movement in the mountains. We'll start out with a little bit darker orange, which is just another name for brown, and the color movement will gradually shift towards gray. Now the shadows will have quite a bit of blue in them. We're using just sort of a slightly more saturated blue-gray here, and why we perceive colored shadows is something we'll touch on perhaps in another episode. But so there we have the background layer, and now the foreground layer. We'll use some of that brown color, but some of the native green of the grass and so forth will show through as well. Now this green, since we're using sort of a reddish background, this appears to be a green, but what it actually is just black and yellow. And we're still using some blue in the shadows, but as we move towards the subject, we'll drop out a lot of that blue in the shadows, and we'll just simply use more black, which is what you see in nature. The distant shadows on distant things appear somewhat blue because of atmospheric perspective. Now some scuffs and some scratches on this spotting scope will kind of sell it as a real object. If it's just shiny and brand new looking, it looks a bit unreal. So we'll start with a little bit of a red wash for those skin tones with some orange on top, and then the shadows will be again a little bit of a blue-gray. Basically, it's a little more orange in the highlights and a little more blue in the shadows. And you'll recall the point I was making when I was telling you girls this story was how patient the lady was, waiting. She didn't take any risky long-range shots. She was waiting for a specific deer to come well within her range. And even though she had to put up with some tough conditions in the mountains, she was very patient about how she conducted her hunt. So we're going to try to capture that mood. The mood here is one of patience. We're not going to have a lot of visual drama or excitement. It's all about waiting for the right opportunity in this case. So we'll put in some detail, and that will wind up looking a bit like this. Now it looks a bit overworked, and I used the multiply mode when putting in the details and the shadows, kind of overused that. So we'll see if we can correct some of that using the mixer brush. Kind of smooth down some of that overwork. But anyway, the point here is you'll often see a very visually dramatic use of orange and blue in a complementary color scheme. But in this case, it's almost entirely just gray and brown. The only saturated color is right where the light is striking the right side of the lady's face, and that little bit of loose hair that's lit up. So we'll add a levels adjustment, some finishing touches here. I decided to help the balance of the picture to have a little bit more saturated color on the left side there where the light is strong. So there we have it. There's our completed piece. And the compositional elements, we have that the scope is a diagonal that points towards the focal point, points towards the lady's face. And also her left eye is at the upper 2/3, so it's kind of a rule of thirds composition.